Welcome everybody to this latest in our series of bite-sized agility webcasts for these agile times that we are in. Today we are pleased to have with us Simon Phillips, who is founder of the Change Maker Group, a 30-strong group of professional change consultants. Simon, welcome.
Hi, John. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is. Nice to virtually meet you. I've started putting that in every sentence now, I think. Simon, we, as the consortium, we did a survey of our membership quite recently, and what emerged from that really strongly was that change management is the number one challenge, I think, really, in organizations. Now, particularly in these agile times when everything is in flux, that isn't surprising. What makes it a challenge is, in a sense, how do we answer the question, how do we make that paradigm shift from managing change projects, which people have templates for and protocols for, to leading change organizations, particularly at the pace that's required now? Tell us a little bit about what you think.
Yeah, thank you, John. So I think it's that very point. It's almost like a subtlety of language. It's really all we need to worry about. The processes and the techniques and the typical toolkit that we would use for managing change projects has all of a sudden become almost number one strategic priority for organizations. The conversations that we're having with people around the boardroom right now is that there's so much change happening and they're not equipped to deal with that. Most organizations, if you think about it, are focused on dealing with business as usual. You know, it's how do I take my strategy, build up the plans for all of that to make to fulfill that strategy, and then how do we create it, make it happen, and how do we measure success at the end of it? It's very little in that conversation that's about complexity and uncertainty and dynamism, if you like. And I loved your introduction there in terms of how do we do things at pace, because that's the new piece that's part of the strategic thinking that organizations are needing to put in place. They don't necessarily do things at pace. New starters in industries, steal a march and do things at pace, but by and large, existing organizations do things routinely, in a very secure way, in a way that's very highly risk managed, and very rarely is it deploying what we would call game-changing thinking. Actually, John, I've got a quick diagram that I've put together to maybe help explain this in a little bit more detail. Let me just flip over to that now. 1 second.
Yep.
This is where
great.
You've got to crank the machine in the background while it just gets it working for us. Let me go into slideshow so it takes over the whole screen. There we go. So I've called it the uncertainty busting matrix. So, and basically it's a learning model. It's how quickly can organizations learn, because that's what they need to do. People don't necessarily fear change in the way that, is traditionally thought about. What people fear is uncertainty. They fear not knowing what to do next. And so what this is saying is, if we look at the bottom axis from left to right, it's learning from failure. And what we're saying is you probably need, as an organization in these times, you need to acquire the ability, and based on what we said about the way organizations are currently structured, you've got to acquire that ability to fail fast. And you've got to not get despondent, if you like. Despondency arises when we try one thing and it doesn't work.
Yep. And we assumed that was the solution and it didn't work for us.
Exactly. And most organizations, they have one backup plan. Yep. So they've got to get into that mindset of we've got to try lots of things. But just in terms of the bottom axis, it's that ability to embrace failure and see it as learning. The top, vertical axis is more about experimentation. Where are the creative people in your organization, and how can you harness their ability to think differently and encourage them to do that over and over again? But, and this is where things get haphazard if they're just being creative and we're not actually learning from each of the experiments that we try.
Right.
So it is that beautiful combination of learning from the experimentation that allows organizations to become emerging champions. And we're finding people get this quite quickly in terms of the behavior change that's required. So think about this from board level perspective. What they're being challenged to do with this model and with our current agile environment, as you called it, is they've got to embrace experimentation. They've got to embrace failing fast and trying things, and they've got to develop that sort of learning culture. Now, if we apply that in the agile world, I haven't said anything there in terms of vocabulary that would be alien to an agile consultant delivering an agile project.
Yep.
And that's the point here. It's exactly the same language that we can now raise up from project level to strategic change level. And we should be advising boards and CEOs and other execs on how to cope. So there's an element of resilience thinking in there, but how to cope and how to thrive in environments that are filled with uncertainty. Now, obviously, change management methodologies are trying to pin down a certain degree of certainty around the projects that we're doing. But we know that we've got to be flexible, that we've got to move with the opportunities. We've got to meet every day to just check how are things going and measure. And we're open to the fact that we may not get the results that we want every time. And that type of thinking, we've now got to raise up to the board level. Is that helpful? Any questions before I take the diagram down?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the diagram is great. I'm very visual, and I like things that show me visually how to differentiate between what is helpful and what is not, and that's a great example of it. One of the things that jumps out of this, in fact, three things really. One of them is the idea that business as usual. Organizations need to get used to the idea that business as usual will now be conducted at pace. Yeah. With an uncertainty quotient attached to it. Yeah. The second thing is this idea that good ideas can come from anywhere, which is one of the 9 principles of agile leadership, and the idea that actually allowing the organization to utilize all of its resources from the C-suite to the rest of the organization to generate that experimentation, that willingness to experiment, and that acceptance of learning from failure means that we have to accept good ideas might be generated anywhere. And then I think the crucial point here is about this raising of the language up the organization towards the C-suite. And I know, in the past it's become very evident that language is one of the things that's differentiated the strategic people in an organization from the operational people. And maybe now one of the challenges that we've got as change makers is to try and bridge that language gap so that both sides understand the language of each other.
Definitely. I mean, I was playing with some sort of scenarios earlier, and I was thinking it's actually all about taking scrums and sprints to the boardroom,
yes.
Because that's how it's such vivid language. Yep. It's language that most people understand, and it will enable them to think quickly about what's changed, because they're aware of all the uncertain elements, but there's some things that are very certain, and that is that they need to act at pace.
Oh, that's excellent, because I think that if we contrast that vividity in the language with the slightly anodyne language of corporate strategy, I think there's room there for people's minds to start to move at pace if we use a different language as well. Simon, thank you very, very much indeed. That's a real eye-opener, I think, and a good start. I think we'll be revisiting this change management transformation into leading change on a number of occasions in the future. In the meantime, Simon Phillips, founder of the Change Maker Group, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, John.